Ancient Hawaiians believed this was where the dead left the world. And even today, people say this place feels wrong. Not dangerous in an obvious way, not haunted in the way stories usually describe. Something quieter than that. A feeling that the farther you walk toward the western edge of Oahu, the less connected you become to everything behind you. And that's what makes Kaʻena Point State Park different from almost every other place in Hawaii. Because this wasn't treated as a beautiful landmark or a sacred monument people gathered around. It was treated like a boundary, a place where the physical world ended and something else began. And when a belief like that survives for generations, tied to the same exact location, it raises a question that becomes difficult to ignore. Why here? Why this isolated stretch of coastline exposed to open ocean, harsh wind, and endless horizon? Because throughout history, humans attach spiritual meaning to places for a reason. And sometimes the reason is symbolic. But other times, the place itself creates the feeling first. And that possibility is what makes Kaʻena Point so unsettling. Because standing there, looking west into nothing but open ocean, it becomes easier to understand how people could believe this was the final edge of the world. At the far western edge of Oahu, beyond the resorts, highways, and crowded beaches most visitors associate with Hawaii, the landscape begins to change. The roads narrow, the structures disappear. Civilization slowly falls behind you until the island starts feeling less inhabited and more exposed. And eventually, the land gives way to something harsher. Dry terrain, jagged coastline, volcanic rock, and waves crashing against an edge that feels unfinished, as if the island simply stopped. This is Kaʻena Point State Park, one of the most isolated and culturally significant places on Oahu. And isolation is the key word, because unlike other sacred locations marked by temples or monuments, Kaʻena Point derives its power almost entirely from atmosphere and geography. Nothing about it feels designed for comfort. There's no protective reef softening the ocean beyond the point. No towering structures welcoming people inward. Just open coastline stretching toward an empty horizon that seems to pull attention away from the island itself. And that environment matters more than most people realize. Because throughout human history, places positioned at the edge of known territory often become associated with transition, death, and uncertainty. They become psychological boundaries as much as physical ones. And Kaʻena Point fits that pattern perfectly. The farther west you move, the quieter the island becomes. Fewer sounds, fewer people, less movement. Eventually, it stops feeling like part of Hawaii altogether and begins feeling like the last reachable piece of land before something unknown. And that emotional shift is important because it explains why ancient Hawaiians viewed this place differently. Not because of something built there, but because of what the place itself seemed to communicate. To ancient Hawaiians, Kaʻena Point was not simply remote, it was spiritual territory. According to traditional belief, this was a place where souls departed from the world of the living and moved into the next existence. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Spirits were believed to travel here after death, crossing beyond the physical world from this exact edge of the island. And that distinction changes everything about how the location was understood. Because this wasn't treated like folklore meant only for storytelling. It shaped behavior. People approached the area with caution and respect because they believed it served a real purpose within the structure of life and death itself. And once you understand that, the environment begins to feel different. The exposed cliffs, the endless western horizon, the violent ocean below, the lack of shelter. It all reinforces the same idea, that this is not a place meant for permanence. It's a place associated with departure. And this worldview reflected a larger Hawaiian understanding of the relationship between land, ocean, ancestry, and spirit. Places carried meaning beyond appearance. Certain locations were believed to hold emotional and spiritual weight because of what generations experienced there. And Kaʻena Point stood apart even among those places because it represented transition itself, a threshold between worlds. And what makes this more powerful is that the belief survived despite the absence of physical proof. No massive ruins, no grand temples carved into stone, just continuity. Generation after generation preserving the same idea about the same isolated coastline. And normally, beliefs without reinforcement fade over time, but this one didn't, because the environment continued reinforcing it. Even now, people who reach the point often describe the same thing, not fear exactly, but a strange emotional stillness, a silence that feels heavier than it should. And whether that comes from belief, atmosphere, or something deeper, the effect remains the same. The place continues affecting people in ways that are difficult to dismiss completely. And this is where the story stops feeling historical, because even today, Kaʻena Point does not feel like the rest of Oahu. Reaching it takes effort. You walk farther away from roads, noise, and activity, until eventually the island begins to feel stripped down to its most exposed form: wind, rock, ocean, and sky. And something happens psychologically when people enter environments like that. The absence of normal distraction changes perception. Small sounds become sharper. Distance feels larger. Time slows down. And at Kaʻena Point, those effects are amplified by the knowledge of what people once believed happened there. Because once you know this place was associated with death and spiritual transition, every part of the environment begins reinforcing the idea. The crashing ocean no longer feels scenic, it feels endless. The cliffs no longer feel beautiful, they feel final. And this is where it stops making sense in a normal way. Because people who know nothing about Hawaiian tradition still describe the same atmosphere: isolation, unease, silence that feels unnatural. And whether those reactions come from suggestion or instinct, they continue strengthening the reputation of the place itself. Because once a location becomes associated with transition between worlds, people stop interacting with it casually. They begin projecting meaning onto every detail. And over time, the atmosphere itself becomes part of the legend, which creates a strange contradiction. There's almost nothing physically present at Kaʻena Point to explain its reputation, and yet the reputation continues surviving anyway. Not because of evidence, but because the experience of standing there seems to preserve the belief on its own. What makes Kaʻena Point especially fascinating is that modern Hawaii developed around it without fully dissolving its identity. Normally, once isolated places become accessible, mystery fades. Tourism, infrastructure, and exposure tend to weaken old beliefs because the environment no longer feels untouched. But Kaʻena Point resisted that transformation. Even now, it remains difficult, exposed, and strangely disconnected from the rest of the island. And that preservation matters, because the belief surrounding the point was never dependent on buildings or artifacts. It depended entirely on atmosphere. The farther west you move, the more the island feels like it's running out of land. And psychologically, humans respond strongly to places where geography creates emotional tension. Cliffs, open ocean, endless horizon, environments where safety suddenly feels fragile. And that may explain why Kaʻena Point carried such spiritual weight for generations. Because people often interpret emotional experience through belief systems available to them. Ancient Hawaiians may not have seen this place as frightening because of superstition. They may have seen it as sacred because the environment itself demanded respect. And that possibility changes how you understand the legend entirely. Because maybe Kaʻena Point became spiritually significant not because people invented meaning there, but because the place itself created the feeling first. And if that's true, then the survival of the belief becomes easier to understand. Because even today, standing at the edge of that coastline, with nothing beyond it but open Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly westward, the idea still feels strangely possible. So why did ancient Hawaiians believe Kaʻena Point was where spirits left the world? One explanation is practical, that isolated environments naturally become associated with death, transition, and mystery because humans instinctively project meaning onto places that feel emotionally overwhelming. But that explanation doesn't fully resolve the tension, because the emotional consistency surrounding Kaʻena Point survived for centuries without needing physical proof to support it. And that raises a more uncomfortable possibility, that certain places affect human perception in ways that are difficult to separate from instinct itself. Places where isolation, geography, atmosphere, and expectation combine into something that feels larger than explanation. And maybe that's why Kaʻena Point endured, not because people feared the unknown blindly, but because standing there genuinely felt different enough to preserve the belief across generations. And that possibility is difficult to dismiss completely, because some places are remembered for events, some are remembered for structures, but Kaʻena Point is remembered almost entirely for a feeling, a sensation that something changes when you reach the edge. And that's what keeps the mystery alive. Not proof, not evidence, but continuity. The fact that even now, standing there at sunset with the ocean swallowing the horizon and the island disappearing behind you, the idea still makes sense. Maybe Kaʻena Point became sacred because people feared it, or maybe people feared it because something about it genuinely felt sacred. Some places aren't remembered because of what happened there, but because of what people believed was waiting beyond them. And if this made you question why certain places still hold power after generations, you're not the only one thinking it, and you're in the right place. Join us next time. Tilt and chill. Stay curious.